What? Needs to be open?
No, I was just.
Or locks
wondering-
itself?
I was just wondering if you left it open for a specific reason or.
I don't know, both these doors were open. So if we compare ourselves to somebody who is less than we are, they have less money or whatever criteria that we're using, we refer to that as a downward social comparison. And we, of course, we see these all the time. People will decide to compare themselves to somebody that has more problems than they do, and then we will see ourselves in a more positive light. That's what we like. Anyway, when a setback occurs, the individual can focus on and perhaps exaggerate how good they are at something unrelated to their setback, compensating for the pain of failure. You lose a race in running track and you say, well, at least I'm a good basketball player. Here's this guy doing one-arm push-ups and doing a Rubik's Cube, which is kind of an odd thing to do. They can self-enhance by recruiting other kinds of positive thoughts. So that's what we're looking for. Sure, I'm an idiot when it comes to mathematics, but at least I can write, that kind of thing. Discounting is reducing the perceived importance of the domain in which an individual performed badly. My son was a wrestler. He played soccer and he ran track and cross country, and he was a really fast runner. He was a really good soccer player, but in wrestling he was somewhat mediocre. He was really strong, but that was about it. So if he could out-muscle the guy, then he would win. If he couldn't out-muscle the guy, and the guy had better technique than he did, then he would lose. Guess which sport he dropped out of? Soccer, track, cross country, or wrestling? Guess which one he dropped out of?
Soccer?
Soccer. He was a good soccer player.
Wrestling.
Wrestling, of course, because he's only mediocre in wrestling. So in order to enhance his feelings of accomplishment, of course, he dropped out of the one sport that he wasn't as good at or wasn't as successful at. He actually was pretty good, but he was not as successful in track and cross country and soccer. He always won, but in wrestling he didn't. People who might attribute the cause of their actions to something outside themselves. This is an external attribution in contrast to an internal attribution where they see the cause as within themselves. And of course we would rather think that we were cheated rather than the fact that we couldn't do it on our own. If you guys get a bad grade, and of course midterms are coming out next week. Not next week.
This
The
week.
9th. They come out on the 9th. I have to turn my grades in on the 9th. Do you get a bad grade, whose fault is it? Is it yours or is it mine? No, it's not. It's mine. Obviously, it's mine. If you get a bad grade, if you get a good grade, is it your fault or is it my fault? It's your fault, of course, because you got a good grade. It's not that I gave you the grade. So that's the way it works. This thing's about to fall over, I think. There it goes. Okay, so we need to know who to blame, and the answer is it's always, if it's something good, it's your fault, and if it's something bad, it's obviously my fault. That's just the way the world works. Some people dissipate their personal failures by basking in the reflected glory of a successful group they identify with, like a sports team. Well, yeah, so maybe I'm not a very good football player, but I just love the Cardinals. Wait a minute, are they successful? Who won the Super Bowl this year?
Chiefs.
The Chiefs, that's right, the Kansas City Chiefs. They barely lost last year and they won this year. So yes, I'm a Chiefs fan, of course, so that I can bask in the glory of their Super Bowl win. Research seems to show that European Americans, even at the young age, tend to maintain fairly high self-enhancing motivations. And this is something that irritates people that are around Europeans. Europeans think they are the best. They think that their culture is better than everybody else's. And of course, that's the way they've been functioning for hundreds of years. Trop and Wright in 2003 found that preschool and elementary school European American children chose self-enhancing images at 92% compared to a similar group of Mexican American students at 82%. So European Americans are they're right up there at the top. They think that they're the best people as compared to Mexicans who only chose positive thought images, enhancing images at 82%. But what about everybody else? Well, let's look at everybody else. When Freiberg and Marcus in 2003 looked at a group of elementary school Native Americans, they found that less than half made positive statements about themselves. And this is a group of Native Americans. Now, I don't know exactly where Marcus and Freiberg did their research. Could have been here, could have been in the Northern Plains, could have been in Nebraska, I don't know, could have been in Oklahoma. But those Native Americans, whoever they were, then, like I said, they may have been here, but only less than half of them showed positive images of themselves. The authors saw these results as consistent with the understanding that Native Americans are less independent, and independence is related to self-enhancement. So the more independent the country, the more positive images that they maintain about themselves. So when we're looking at Europeans, people of European ancestry, we're looking at a group of individuals that really think highly of themselves. Mexican Americans, of course, do Mexican Americans identify with their Europeanness, or do they identify with their Americanness? And the answer is they identify with their Spanish heritage. And of course, Spain is part of Europe. This did not prove true of the collectivistic Maori of New Zealand, so they thought negatively of themselves. This did not prove true of African Americans. They didn't think highly of themselves either. This did not prove true of the Israeli Druze. The Israeli Druze is a really kind of an interesting religion. It's kind of halfway in between Judaism and Muslimism. So the Druze are kind of hated by everybody because they're not quite Jews and they're not quite Muslims. So people tend to pick on them a lot. Did not prove true of Asian Indians. 93% of European Canadians had high self-esteem. What did we see with Americans? We saw 92%. And here with European Canadians, we see 93%. Canadians are really kind of interesting. We're going to talk about Canadians being different from Americans in just a second. But Canadians, you have to remember that Canada is still part of England. It's part of their Commonwealth. So even though it's an independent country, there are a lot of things that are connected with England. So the English educational system is part of the Canadian education system. That's interesting. And you're going up to Canada, or have you already been?
No, I'm still going up there.
Next week?
No, May.
In May?
Yeah, that's if they don't close the borders for the
because of
the whole
well, that could be
coronavirus.
55% of Japanese Canadians had high self-esteem. Now, why in the world would the Japanese Canadians be different than the European Canadians? And the answer is because European Canadians, of course, have controlled that country since their independence, since they broke away from France. Japanese Canadians are relatively new in Canada, of course, 55%. Masses of research show that Americans find success more memorable, probably because they think more about them. And Japanese tend to find failures more memorable because they think more about their failures. And Americans think more about their successes. So if I have successes and failures, which am I going to concentrate on? As an American or as a European, and as an American, I will concentrate on my successes and I'll eliminate the negative and remember all of my successes. After failing at a task, North Americans tend to discount the importance of the task. So if I've failed at things before, I'm not a very good mechanic. I tried to replace the starter on my car, on my truck, about a year and a half ago, and I couldn't get it in, so I had to call a mechanic to come in, and he had to fix it in my yard. It was a cold day, but he got it in, and he got it in like 5 minutes. I mean, I was really embarrassed since, you know, I'd worked on it for days. I'm just a really bad mechanic. But do I think about that? No, I don't think about that. I think about my successes as an instructor. I think of my ability to, I don't know, I can do things. I can do something. I can mow the lawn really well. And of course, up in Iowa, we have huge lawns. Americans tend to bask in the reflected glory of their sports teams, while the Japanese are more likely to be critical of their local team as the opposition. And this is really kind of interesting because when I'm a San Francisco Giants fan, if I went to San Francisco and watched a baseball game, I'd be cheering on my team. But in Japan, it doesn't work that way. The home team, the home crowd is more critical of their team than anybody else. It's more like, I don't know if you've ever been to Philadelphia or if you know anything about the Philadelphia teams, but the Philadelphia fans are the worst. They just hate their own team. And that's the way it is all over Japan. The Japanese are more critical of their own team than they are of everybody else, of the other teams. In the United States, of course, if you're playing we went to a football game in Los Angeles. This is when the Rams were in Los Angeles. And they're playing against the Steelers, and my son is a Steelers fan. So we went to this football game, and I'll tell you what, the Raiders or the
Rams.
or the Rams. They were the Los Angeles Raiders. The Raiders were just horrible. Their fans were just god awful. They were starting fights all over the place. It was just terrible. Did you need something? I'm supposed to be in that room, but I couldn't get the television to work. So I'm in here instead.
The TV?
Yeah, I couldn't get the
Okay.
TV to work.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. Heine, of course, is the author of your book. He's married to a Japanese lady. He went over to Japan right after he graduated from college to teach English. And of course, he fell in love with a Japanese lady, and they're married. And that's one of the reasons why he talks about East Asians all the time. And he talks about Canadians. He's from New Brunswick, so British Columbia. He's from British Columbia. So he talks about the Canadians all the time, and a lot of times he compares Americans with Canadians because he's Canadian, of course, and Canadians like to think of themselves as superior to Americans, which is kind of interesting. If it is something negative about people from the United States, he will tell you that it's somebody from the United States. If it's something negative about North Americans, if it's something negative about Canadians, he talks about North Americans. He doesn't ever say anything negative about Canadians, which is just a hoot. It's not a bad book, but it's really kind of obvious that he is Canadian, and he likes Canadians, and he doesn't especially like Americans. Heine and others have speculated that East Asians are just as motivated as Westerners to evaluate themselves positively, merely as their group selves instead of their individual selves. So they don't mind seeing something positive, but they don't want to see themselves as positive. They want to see their group as positive. So if it's their baseball team, they don't want to say, well, you know, I only lost 2 games last year and I won 19. They don't want those types of accolades. They would like to say our team was very good this year, instead of I was very good this year. That's the way the Japanese are, the East Asians. East Asians like themselves as much as Westerners do, but seem to be more self-critical of their competence. So when they can't do something, they focus on what they can't do. Americans, we don't focus on what we can't do, we focus on our successes. And that's the difference between the two. One of the phenomena of Craigslist and eBay is the endowment effect. Westerners tend to value something more after they own it, which makes them inflate the prices they're asking for. Usually they're junk. I don't know if you've ever bought anything on eBay or Craigslist, but it's junk. Yeah, you're buying somebody else's old junk.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. We see the opposite effect with East Asians. So if they own something and they sell it, they'll sell it for a much lower price than we will. We always try to inflate the price. It's like we're the greediest people in the world in the United States. So we try to get lots and lots of money for things that just don't work very well at all. Or something that is junk, and we're trying to sell it for a lot of money. Miller and colleagues in 1997 and then again in 2002 looked at children's stories in the United States and Taiwan. Fascinating stuff. They found that the Taiwanese children's stories are different from American children's stories. American stories focus on the children's attention on their strengths, while Taiwanese stories focused on areas that needed correcting. So if you read a children's story in the United States, one is it's trying to inflate you. It's trying the story is trying to build you up. But in Taiwan, if you read a children's story, it's almost like they're trying to tear the kid down. My God, they're always trying to show how they need to be corrected. The European American parents viewed self-esteem as central to child rearing. Taiwanese children express the belief that too much self-esteem can lead to frustration when things aren't working out well for the children. So they have totally different parenting ideas than we have in the United States. We're trying to build our children up. So if we go into an elementary classroom, the teacher is trying to help. This is really kind of interesting because when I was at Fort Belknap, we had a math teacher. We had a difficult time finding a math teacher because the schools in Montana are just horrible as far as math is concerned. They're just terrible, especially on the reservations. And there's 7 reservations up there. So the reservation schools, the kids can barely add and subtract. I mean, it's that bad. It's really, really bad. So we had a lady from Korea. We hired a lady out of Korea. And she came over and she started teaching classes. Well, the first semester she taught, she flunked everybody in the class. Everybody. Nobody passed the class. And so our dean talked to her and she told her, you can't do this. And she said, but nobody could do anything. Everybody was mad at me because every time I corrected them, they got upset. The difference was, in the United States, of course, the way that we teach, the way that we handle things, is that we accentuate the positive and don't talk about the negative. But in Korea, it's the very opposite. If there's something wrong, if you're not very good at adding, multiple figures, then that's what we focus on. That's what they focus on. But in the United States, we go, see, you can do these problems. You add and subtract really well. You just can't divide very well. And of course, the kids that's the way they were used to being treated. And this poor little Korean girl, a little tiny thing. Everybody was madly in love with her, except me, of course. I don't fall in love that frequently. All the kids were in love with her. And they had a really hard time. And they felt bad because they flunked the class, but everybody flunked it. And so the next semester she changed the way that she had to really shift gears in her brain because she wanted to be critical. That's the way you do it in Korea. That's the way you teach people in Korea, is by focusing on the negative. But in the United States, of course, we don't do that. So it took her a couple semesters, but eventually she figured out what was going on. Research shows that the notion of individual selves didn't emerge in Western literature until the 12th century. This gets really kind of weird. We're going to talk about religion now, and I don't mean to attack anybody's religion, but the reality is religion has caused a lot of interesting ideas. At this point, the Christian concept of the Last Judgment changed from being an issue of salvation of collectives to the salvation of individual souls. And this happened in the 12th century, which is about the 1100. In 1100, there were a couple different things that happened. One of them was that the church split. Once upon a time, there was only one Christian church, and there was just one Christian church. And then in the 11th century, actually it was in the 11th century, it was in the 10,000s. In the 11th century, the Catholic Church split in half, and at that point, actually it was just the church. It split in half, and the people in the East became Orthodox. They became Orthodox Christians, and the people in the West became Catholic. So the church split in the 11th century, and it was after the 11th century, in the 12th century, when they changed the idea that it was your job as an individual to go to heaven, not your village's job to go to heaven, not your group of people living in wherever in Spain. It wasn't your job. It was now the individual's job to go to heaven. Before they could bring people into heaven en masse, because there was only one church. Now they were competing with another group, and that group were the Orthodox. Now, if you look at the Orthodox Church and you look at the Catholic Church, which one of them is more fundamental, is the question that people ask. And the answer is the Orthodox Church is a lot more fundamental than the Catholic Church is. But this is something that happened in the 11th century, and then into the 12th century. And I've done something. I probably turned it off. And I did. That's what I get for messing with it. What have I done?
Your battery's low?
I just changed this battery not very long ago. I probably just punched one of these buttons.
Does it go to the laptop or your computer or TV?
No, it's my laptop. Oh, I know what's wrong. Okay. Come on. What a day I'm having with technology. There we go. With the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, many Protestant sects maintained a belief in the predestination, or the idea that one's fate was determined before you're born. And if predestination is true, then you don't have to worry about being good, because if you're predestined to go to heaven and you're predestined to do something, then that's what's going to happen. I mean, if your script is already written, then all you have to do is kind of sit back and let it happen. And that's predestination. This gave people a great drive to enhance themselves as they proved that they were one of God's chosen people. Now, since they are predestined, since you know that everything is good, it gave people the impetus, it gave people the drive to try to prove that they were one of God's chosen people. So in order for them to be, they knew they were going to go to heaven anyway, but they had to prove this to everybody else around them, that they were one of God's chosen people. So they worked really, really hard. They tried to accumulate. This is where greed comes from. They tried to accumulate as much stuff as they possibly could, just to prove that they were one of God's chosen people. This gets really kind of interesting, because there are different sects. I don't know if you've studied Protestantism, but Protestants are really kind of interesting people. Most of the groups say that their way, it's either their way or their highway. Either you practice religion the way that we tell you to practice religion, or you go into hell. This is really kind of interesting, because they're all different and they all have different ideas. So the question is, how the hell do you get to go to heaven? And the answer is, well, you follow one of these precepts, but you have to follow the right one. You have to go to the right church. So if you're a Methodist, is that the right way to do it? Or if you're a Baptist, or if you're a Presbyterian, or if you're a Episcopalian, these are all different denominations of Protestantism. What about Jehovah's Witnesses? They're really fascinating people. Jehovah's Witnesses have only been around for about 120 years. But they say that there's only 144,000 people that get to go to heaven. And if you're a member of the Jehovah's Witness, then potentially you're one of those groups that gets to go to heaven. But you got to be good. We ain't screwing around here. You've got to do select things while you're here, and then you get to go to heaven. But if you mess up, you don't get to go. So one of the things is evangelizing, and this is one of the reasons why they come to your house and read you out of the Bible. Now, the interesting thing about Jehovah's Witnesses is they can't read the Bible with somebody that's not going to heaven. So you can't read the Bible with them. This is fascinating. It drives my wife crazy.
I wonder what will happen if you refuse and just close the door on them.
Then, well, they already know you're going to hell anyway. They're going to heaven. Well, maybe they're going to heaven because they want to be one of the 100. There's only 144,000 people that get to go to heaven, according to the Jehovah's Witnesses. So they know that they get to go. They're just they have to evangelize. This is part of their game, part of what's going on.
Heaven must be the size of a Coliseum or something.
144,000? Oh, the Coliseum's what, 101,000? No, that's not a Rose Bowl. I don't think we have a stadium that holds 144,000 people.
The two Coliseums.
Everybody that goes to this game gets to go to heaven. Oh, good. Faith is a strong East. And I just find this fascinating because I've had these arguments with a lot of Christians over the years, including my wives, select ones. So. My second wife was a one-way person. There's only one way to go to heaven, and their symbol was the finger pointing up. It was the index finger, not the middle finger pointing up, which I always, every time I saw her shirt, I laughed. She was upset that I wasn't going to go to heaven, but she was, because she's a member of that group. Face is a strong Eastern idea that barely registers among Westerners. We don't think of face, but in Asia, it's very, very important. Face has been defined as the amount of social value others give you if you live up to the standards associated with your position. The higher your social position, the greater the amount of face available to you. I didn't mean to offend anybody with religion. I just find it fascinating that all this stuff takes place.
Thank God, Navajo.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Thank God I'm a Navajo. Wait a minute, that's another song.
Thank God, Navajo.
If others grant you face, you'll enjoy all the prerequisites that come with the enhanced status and power. One characteristic of face is that it's more easily lost than it is gained. And so in Asia, of course, they're always trying to maintain themselves. They need to maintain their face. It's much easier. It's hard to really gain face, but it's real easy to lose it. All you have to do is cheat or steal or do something. When we were in Japan, they said, don't worry if you forget something on the bus, because it'll be there the next day. If somebody takes that, if a Japanese person takes that, they lose face. So that nobody would take it, despite the fact, even if they needed it, they wouldn't take it. So the next day it'll be right where you left it, as weird as that is. And it's because of face. It makes them very honest people, which is kind of fun. The amount of face an individual has access to is determined by their position. Thus, increasing face can only be increased with promotion. And that's, of course, what they're looking for. They're trying to maintain more and more face. While face is difficult to enhance, face is lost whenever individuals fail to live up to the standards of their roles. And of course, taking something that belonged to somebody else would be something that they would lose face for. Face is always vulnerable, and because others determine a person's face, people must count on the goodwill of others to be able to maintain their face. Since face is so easily lost, one strategy is for people to adopt a cautious approach and to try to ensure that they are not acting in a way that might lead others to reject them. This approach is known as a prevention orientation, being defensive and being very cautious. And of course, if you've ever been to Asia, if you've ever been around Asians, this is usually the way that they function, is by being cautious and being very defensive, because they don't want to lose face. Prevention orientation is contrasted with promotion orientation, where the individual is more concerned with advancing themselves and aspiring for gains. Prevention seeks to avoid bad things, while promotion seeks to secure good things. So promotion orientation is where you always put yourself forward. And this is the reason why Americans have a difficult time functioning in Asia, because they are always using promotion orientation, which is offensive to the Asians, to the Japanese, to the Chinese, to the Koreans, to the Vietnamese. So if an American goes to Asia, of course, they have a difficult time functioning, because in the United States, look who's the president of the United States, one of the biggest promoters that we've ever had in the United States. And what does he do as the president of the United States? All he does is talk about himself. I know, it's really kind of interesting watching him function. It really doesn't matter what venue he's in, he's always trying to promote himself. And sometimes he talks about himself in the third person. He talks about himself as Donald Trump. Normally you don't talk about yourself in the third person. You talk about yourself in the first person. I did this or I did that. He doesn't do that. He uses his name a lot. And his kids do exactly the same thing. Donald Jr. got on the internet, or he had an interview this week, and he was attacking the Democrats. Of course, he was attacking the Democrats because the coronavirus, this whole thing could bring down his presidency if the coronavirus explodes. So he was saying that the Democrats are trying to politicize the coronavirus epidemic, which is funny because by saying that, he's politicizing the coronavirus. I just thought it was really kind of funny. Not only that, but he used a word incorrectly when he was talking, and it just drives me crazy. Dr. Standing Courage used to use words that weren't quite right. Yeah, that drove me nuts, because it just didn't fit. I mean, I'm reading his sentences, and they don't quite work. But Trump he and his son both used words that were not correct. And I just wonder, it didn't really change the meaning of the sentence, it just made the sentence meaningless because the two words didn't work. Canadian and Japanese participants were given a faux test that they failed. Everybody failed the test. They were given a chance to either work on the problems or focus on their successes in the test. And this is what we were talking about before with the Korean teacher. Canadian participants chose to focus on things they did well, and that's promotion focus. With the Japanese, on the other hand, they decided that they used prevention focus, of course, because they needed to save face. They were more interested in working on things that they did poorly, apparently so they could improve themselves and be less likely to fail in the future. Failure is embarrassing as far as they're concerned, and so they didn't want to fail in the future, so they used prevention focus. This self-improvement motivation, a desire to seek out potential weaknesses and work on correcting them, is strong motivation in East Asian contexts. Eastern and Western cultures deal with strengths and weaknesses differently. East Asian parents are more likely to call their children's attention to their weaknesses. You can imagine living in that type of a household where they're always talking about your weaknesses rather than your strengths. They don't ever build you up, they just break you, they just tear you down. So you can imagine living in that kind of a household rather than an American household where we're constantly referring to your strengths. And of course, as I was raising my children, and my son was running cross country and running track and playing soccer and wrestling, of course, I'm trying to mention some of the positive things about all of the things that he does. And of course, that's the way Americans handle things. But if I had been an Asian, if I had been a tiger father, I would have pointed out all of his deficits. And it would have, he wouldn't have felt so positively about
I think
himself.
some Navajo families go through that too. Beat down.
Where you beat them down? Beat the kids down.
No, not beat them, but just like,
You focus on the weaknesses, not
Yeah.
on their strengths. See,
no support.
do you think, did it work? Does it work? Maybe that's why the Native Americans, remember the Native Americans didn't have high self-esteem. Yeah,
It's the reason why.
self-enhancement. Because
just
their
like-
parents are
it's just
constantly
like-
tearing them down.
It's just like adults before me, they're just like mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. As East Asians have increased their fortunes, they have become big consumers of brand name luxury goods. Purchasing and displaying brand name goods can increase your face, and for that reason, they're always buying Bentleys, they're buying Mercedes, they're trying to buy high-end products so that they can increase their face. A key motivation for these acquisitions is to achieve social recognition. Of course, the more social recognition that you have, the more face that you gain. In 1904-1905, Max Weber, who was a sociologist, printed a controversial but influential series of essays entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, this is really kind of interesting. Max Weber is German. And of course, the German world is separated into the people living in the north who were Lutheran and the people living in the south who were Catholic. So he was talking about the Protestant ethic and how there's a difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. Weber attempted to determine how capitalism was able to emerge from the traditional economics of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe was kind of an interesting place because in medieval Europe, there were people that had everything, and then there were people that had nothing, and they became the workers. Now, how in the world did this strict bifurcation, this strict separation of the two groups of individuals, the royals who had everything, and the peasants who had nothing, how in the world did capitalism come out of that dichotomy? That was the question. And that was the question that he asked, and this is the answer that he came up with. Of course, he wasn't the first individual to look at this. The first individual to look at this was the socialist Karl Marx. Marx felt that capitalism was a result of surplus capital that came from the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Christianity is really kind of interesting. Now you have to remember that what was happening in Europe was that everybody became Christian. So Germany was Christian, France was Christian, Spain was Christian. All of these countries, England and the Netherlands, they all were Christian countries. And since they were Christian countries, usury, which means borrowing money, was against the religion. So people couldn't accumulate wealth. They had a really difficult time accumulating wealth, even if they were royal of the royal family. They couldn't lend money, and they couldn't make money from lending money. This was against the rules. So the only people that could do that were Jewish people, because they didn't have the same Christian strictures on them. And for this reason, capitalism was really slow in getting started, because nobody had enough money to do anything. They did have money, and they could spend it, but they couldn't lend it to people, because that was known as usury. So it was really kind of interesting. They needed, in order for them to make any money at all, in order for capitalism to take place, they needed extra stuff, because if I'm growing enough corn just to feed my family and all the people around me, I don't have any extra food to sell to somebody else. So they needed a surplus, and they needed to change from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And he said that it was surplus capital. So they had some really good years where they could sell their surplus produce. And of course, then they built a factory. And once they built a factory, they started making wheels, and they were able to sell their wheels to other people. Marx also felt that religion was being used by governments to control the people. He referred to Christianity, the church, he referred to it as the opiate of the masses. In other words, the royals used religion to be able to control the peasants and to make them do whatever they wanted them to do. Weber viewed capitalism as a product of people's deriving meaning from a particular cultural context. Capitalism grew out of a belief system that was rooted in a number of cultural ideas that began emerging in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe and North America. So what was going on in the 16th and 17th centuries? Protestantism was breaking away from Catholicism. Once upon a time, of course, there was only the one church. And then the church split in half. And then the Orthodox portion was in the east, and the Catholic portion was in the west. So the Catholic portion was able to control Western Europe for an extended length of time. And then in the 16th and 17th century, this Protestant idea came to the fore. And because it became more popular, now there was two different ideas. And one idea was Protestantism, the other was Catholicism. The ideas that became the foundation of capitalism were the ones that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation had to do with working hard. Hard work. And if you worked hard, then you could create more capital. You could create more money. And of course, because they worked hard, now remember, in the Protestant world, they believed in predestination. So I have to prove to everybody around me that I am one of the chosen people. How do I do that? Well, I don't call myself Navajo. I don't do that. What I do is I make as much money as I possibly can. And if I can make more money, then I can prove to everybody that I am one of the chosen people. As much fun as that is. Protestants emphasize literacy training more than Catholics so that people would be able to read the Bible for themselves. Now, one of the interesting things about the Catholic Church was that their Bible was written in Latin. Well, nobody spoke Latin except for the priests. Latin had gone out of favor. Nobody spoke Latin. They had gone out of favor at the beginning of the first millennium. In 500-600 BC, people stopped speaking Latin. So nobody could read the Bible except for the priests. But the Protestants interpreted the Bible into whatever language was popular in that area. So they interpreted the Bible into German for the Germans. They interpreted it into French for the French. They interpreted it into English for the people living in England. But the Catholics, of course, still had the Roman Bible or the Latin Bible. It was really kind of weird how these things were going on. So when in the world did the Catholics switch from having a Latin Bible to a Bible written in local languages? When did they do that? Mass was delivered in Latin until 1963. 1963. So from 0 until 1963, it was being conducted in a language that the peasants couldn't understand. If they were in Germany and they were holding Mass, the Germans had no idea what they're talking about because the Germans spoke German and Mass was in Latin. As weird as that sounds, it wasn't until 1963 they stopped giving Mass, or they didn't stop actually. They still do it to this day, especially in Rome, but it wasn't conducted in the local language, so nobody understood what they were talking about. But the Protestants, of course, it's one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation, they decided that they were going to conduct everything in the local language so that everybody would understand what was going on. The Catholic Church wanted to interpret the Bible for everybody, so they didn't translate it into any other language other than Latin. So they were the only ones that could read this stuff. So they could tell you, you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. It's right there in the Bible. And of course they could point to it, but it's written in Latin and nobody could read it. Not only that, but a lot of the Protestants didn't read anyway. Why would they read? The only people that were teaching were the religions, was the church. And of course, they only wanted you to read in Latin. They didn't want you to read in French and German, in English, or whatever. As weird as all that sounds. So the Protestant Reformation was huge. It was huge because it gave people the right to understand what their religion was all about. In Catholicism, everybody just believed whatever the hell the priest told them. So the Protestants emphasized literacy. They wanted everybody to be able to think and read on their own. And of course, the Catholic Church, on the other hand, and of course this is fairly negative about the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church didn't want anybody to, that's Kevin. He's not going to go in there, is he? And fix my television. Oh well. I'll tell you what, why don't we stop right here and I'll see if I can catch him.